to talk now about inaugurations. If you're not sure what that word is, that's okay. Inauguration is a word that normally only comes up about every 4 years. It really means the fancy beginning of something. Like in the United States, we use it to refer to when a president begins a term of office. And since presidents are elected every 4 years, usually it only comes up every 4 years. Not all that common a thing. But inaugurations are big deals. They're pretty important. Since the President of the United States is the head of our country, it makes sense that presidential inaugurations are normally held in our nation's capital city, Washington, D.C. And they're usually pretty exciting. It's a lot of celebration. People might be celebrating because we have a free system of government where we get to choose or elect our next leader. They might be celebrating the fact that we have a stable system of government where power passes from one leader to the next after an election. Most likely they're celebrating the fact that the person they voted for won. But whatever the reason for their celebrating, there's a lot of celebrating in Washington, D.C. on the day of the inauguration. And it starts with a parade through the streets of Washington, D.C., taking the new president to the swearing-in ceremony where the oath will be administered. And that's usually on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There, the new president takes the oath of office, and there are speeches and there's music, there's cheering and applause, and parties are held all over the city that night. We actually had a presidential inauguration here in Buffalo once, though. Only once. We're not Washington, D.C. You know right away that this was a pretty unusual inauguration. It's actually unusual in a number of ways. It was over 100 years ago, in 1901, when our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, became president here in Buffalo, in a private home on Delaware Avenue, in the library of that home, which you can see behind me. Well, it was actually different in a lot of ways beyond being in Buffalo instead of Washington. One thing, it happened in September instead of in January, where inaugurations normally happen now. But it was also a very sad occasion. When Theodore Roosevelt became president, there was only a very small group of people and no big crowd gathered. There were no parades. There was no music, no big speeches, certainly no applause or cheering. But that's not because people didn't like Theodore Roosevelt. But there were other reasons why it was different too, and the most important reason is that Theodore Roosevelt hadn't become president because he was just elected. He was becoming president because of a very sad occasion. The president before him, William McKinley, had just suddenly and unexpectedly died. But as vice president, it was Theodore Roosevelt's job now to take over as the new president as quickly as he possibly could. And that meant that he didn't have time to go all the way back to Washington, D.C. He would have to take the oath right here in Buffalo. Theodore Roosevelt understood, though, that that was a very sad occasion, and that it wasn't a time for celebrating. So he wasn't offended that nobody was celebrating him becoming president. That's a very sad kind of situation, and we should hope that it doesn't happen again. If you want to know more, though, about what happened in 1901 with Theodore Roosevelt taking his oath, the home where it happened is still preserved today in a museum in Buffalo. You can visit the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site with your family someday. Or, if you don't have a chance to get here right away, you can also find out more from our website at trsite.org. One thing, though, that was the same between Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration and all of the others is the fact that Theodore Roosevelt took the exact same oath of office as every other president, going all the way back to George Washington. The words are actually specified in the United States Constitution. go through that inauguration, that oath of office ourselves. Now, when you take the oath of office, it's traditional to raise your right hand to signify that you are making a very solemn and important promise. Okay, you're going to help me here now, aren't you, Nat? Okay. Raise your right paw. Okay. Okay, now you're going to repeat after me. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Congratulations! That's it. That's the whole oath right there. Not all that long, but it's a very important statement. And maybe someday you might be on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., taking that oath for real. Maybe someday you'll be becoming President of the United States too. We're actually going to be having a presidential inauguration very soon. The United States had a presidential election on November 3rd of 2020. And on January 20th of 2021, the president will be inaugurated. In some ways, I expect it's going to be a very similar ceremony to most, in that it will be in Washington, D.C., and probably on the steps of the Capitol building. But in a lot of ways, it's going to be a very different and unusual inauguration in its own right. In 2021, our country and the whole world is going through a big crisis with the coronavirus pandemic. And large crowds can be very bad because disease can spread easily in those large crowds, and a lot of people could get sick. The kind of large crowds that would normally gather for an inauguration or at inaugural parties and parades could be very, very bad for the country. So they probably won't do a lot of the things that we normally expect in a presidential inauguration. Some of the events that we're used to seeing will probably be a lot smaller than what they normally would be. And some of them might not even happen at all. But we can find out for ourselves just what happens on January 20th. You can watch it on TV or on the news and see for yourself.